This demo will show you the techniques that we'll be incorporating into your gridded compositions. And I wanted to walk you through some of the watercolor techniques, how to use the watercolors, how to layer the watercolors, and then eventually how to think about incorporating all of those things together into your finalized piece. All right, so our aim is to take our compositions that you've created using the gridded technique. You've worked with the line permanency, and now we're ready to go into it with some color. You can work into these with only colored pencil if you would like. Some of you may decide that you want to work into them using primarily watercolor with very little colored pencil usage. And then there's going to be some of you that want to find that happy medium in between, using colored pencil, using the watercolor, and kind of tying all of those things in together in order to create the rest of your composition. All right, so what I want to do primarily in this video is show you how to go through and work with the watercolors themselves. So I'm going to be working with just a standard watercolor pan, and in order to get them ready, one of the things that you will want to do is take some clean water, and you're just going to put a drop or two of water onto your watercolor pans. Okay, now you don't need to worry about oversaturating it because you are going to add water as you go. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is that you should have some paper towel close by so that you can dab off any excess water that might occur. Right, now you're going to be doing your work into your sketchbook, or if you are a face-to-face student, you're going to be working on just some small cards that are going to provide you with a space to try out these different techniques. Okay, now I've labeled them here on my example. This might be something that you want to do as well. And you can always refer back to this video time and time again until you get through many, if not all, of the techniques. So the first one that I want to show you is wet on dry. Okay, so just as it says here, what you're going to do is you're going to be working wet watercolor on to dry paper. Okay, so wet on dry. A few things that you should know about watercolor is that the colors themselves should remain transparent, which means they should have a bit of sort of thinness to the color. It should allow some of the white of the paper to help show through. Your colors should not be thick and saturated and dark. So when you go to pick up pigment, okay, the color on your brush, you should only ever be using the tip of the brush and getting very little color onto the brush itself. You always want to have just a little piece of paper towel handy, so I'm going to tear a piece off here. This is just in case you end up getting too much color or too much water on your paper. You can always use this to help soak it up. All right, so I'm going to go in and I'm going to select out a color, and I'm just going to do a few of these with just a singular color, and then I'm going to talk to you about color mixing. I'll show you how to use a piece of wax paper or a piece of palette paper to do that, and that'll come a little later on in the demo. All right, so I'm going to go in and just pick up a little bit of orange. So all I did was to kind of go into that dab of water that I already had in the pan. And then to work wet on dry, I'm going to take my wet watercolor, again, just very little into the brush. And then I'm going to work onto dry paper. Okay, now the reason why I'm showing you wet on dry and then eventually, as you can see, wet on wet, is so that you can see a bit of the difference in between what the watercolor looks like when it goes onto dry paper versus when you're working into a wet area. Okay, so this was just an application of color that was simply put on using a wet application of paint onto a dry surface. All right, now I'm going to move on to wet on wet. I'm simply going to rinse out my brush so that I have some clean water. And what I'm going to do for wet on wet is I'm going to make an area on my paper. So imagine as though this is a part of your composition that you've created. You'll notice I keep that paper towel really handy because will go back and dab off any excess paint that I have or water. All right, so I have this area that's wet. Okay, it's not going to pick up too well on camera, but I have this little sort of sheen to that portion of my paper. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up some wet watercolor. Okay, so just like the technique alludes to, I'm putting wet watercolor onto that wet area in my paper. Okay, now as I add it to the wet area, you might start to see that it will begin to kind of creep or crawl over, right? This is a term known as bleeding. Okay, so I'm going to go back. I'm just using some clean water here to help to get that color to just start to move on its own. Now, while that color is wet, this is also a great time that if I wanted to blend colors together, I could certainly go into and pick up another color. And because that area is still wet, it makes it easy to push a new color into the first one that I put down. And with that surface being slightly damp, I can kind of move and manipulate that color more so than when I'm putting it onto a dry surface here. Okay, so that is the technique of wet on wet. All right, now the next one here is basically another form of wet on wet, but I like to call this pooling, P-U-L-L-I-N-G, or bleeding. So this is a way for you to kind of work color over and have it start to get lighter as it goes. All right, so I'm going to take and, sorry, I'm just going to grab some of my paper towel here. All right, in order to do the pooling, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up some of my wet watercolor, and I'm going to actually work onto dry paper. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to pick up some green here. And then I'm going to come over to my paper, and in order to start a pool, I'm actually going to do it here. I'm going to begin to drop some pigment, some color onto my paper. All right. Now, what's going to happen is something that's called pooling the bead. And there's this little dot of green paint that I'm going to rinse out my brush, and then I'm going to go in and I'm going to push or pool, however you want to kind of think of it, with that clean water to continue to work that color into my space. And then as I get here, you'll see there's another bead there. So I'm going to pull that bead with some clean water again. And as I do that, you'll see that it will progressively begin to fade out. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a color that goes from sort of a dark to a medium to a light. Okay, so that's called pooling. All right, now bleeding is very similar, and it kind of just is the same as wet on wet. And one thing I need to do, obviously, if I'm working wet on wet, is I need to make sure that my surface is wet. And I can work kind of like I did here where I showed you wet on wet, just the technique itself. I can work in a way that's very controlled, or I can just kind of dab some color on and let the surface tension or surface pressure of the area that's wet just sort of manipulate and mix the colors on their own. So I'm actually taking a little bit of the control out of it. I'm letting the paint do what it wants. Okay, and you'll see that it'll start to kind of move and bleed on its own. All right, so I think of bleeding as more of a sort of accidental way of painting, where you're taking, again, a bit more of the control aspect out of it, and you're just letting the paint do its thing. Okay, watercolors will go to wherever the dampest area is. So you'll see it'll kind of pool and bleed out. Looks like little veins of color. So that is bleeding. All right, now the last two here are ways that you can create some visual, like textural effects with your watercolors, incorporating in some other materials. So since we worked with Sharpie marker and also with colored pencil, those would be two great not techniques, but great materials to work into this particular piece. So I went through and I laid down some colored pencil to start with. Okay, so here's just paper with colored pencil on it, the same way that over here I have paper with just Sharpie marker on it. All right, what you can do as you play around with these layering techniques is you can decide at what sort of process or what steps you go through when you begin to layer. Okay, so I can put my Sharpie marker or my colored pencil down first, and then I can apply color over top of it. Okay, so if I just grab some color here really quick, I can take that color, a little bit too much, so I'm going to rinse my brush out, get some clean water, because again, I don't want this to be too thick. I want it to be transparent. All right, so you can see I can brush right over top of that watercolor, or sorry, of that Sharpie marker, and those marks will still appear. Now, if I have areas like this here that were already dry, okay, so I had some marks, I added watercolor to it, and now it's dry, I could certainly go back at this point now and add other marks over top of it. So this is that sort of decision making of the process, of the steps. You could lay down the material first and then work watercolor on top of it, or you can lay down watercolor first and then work the other material on top of that. Okay, so the same thing works with the with the colored pencil. I have some colored pencil already laid down, so I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna pick up a color here, and then I can just simply layer a color over top. Now you'll notice, especially with the colored pencil, because we're dropping another color over top of it, you'll notice that the colored pencil color may actually change a bit. Okay, this is because you're creating what we call a color veil, where you're essentially laying another color on top, which optically can begin to alter the colors that you're seeing. Okay, so there's some science behind it. Same deal if I have colored pencil that is dry, or sorry, colored pencil that was down, watercolor over top of it, and now watercolor that's dry, I can definitely work back on top of this in order to add other marks. So it's a great way to visually layer, to bring out some interesting textures, and to add to your composition. Playing around with those layering techniques, right? You can take your colored pencil and you can, sorry about that, you can just sort of go in and add soft applications of color. Okay, where you're not quite filling in all of the white of the paper. And then you could go back in with a watercolor application over top of it. A little too much, so I'm going to dab some off and take that over top. Okay, and you'll see it wasn't quite to my color liking, so I dabbed back into my color, picked up a tiny bit more pigment, and then reapplied. Okay, so this is playing around with layering using colored pencil, layering using Sharpie. You just want to make sure that if you are working back on top of watercolor, you want to make sure that that watercolor is dry. If not, it will mess up your Sharpie markers, and it can mess up your colored pencils too. All right, now the last few techniques that are shown on this video and on my paper are some techniques that you can add, again, some textures into your compositions that look a little different than the layering with the colored pencils or the Sharpie. All right, so those techniques are salt, plastic, and scratching. So I'm actually going to set up scratching first. All right, in order to do scratching, you need something with a slightly sharpened point that you can just simply scratch to the surface of the paper. All right, so one of the things that I thought of that I would think most of you would have readily available would be a paper clip. And if you take that paper clip and kind of fold it or bend it outward, the point of it is sharp enough to create little scratches. So you could use that to scratch onto the surface of your paper. Okay, and I'm going to show you what will happen when you add the watercolor here in just a moment. So I created some scratches. I know they're not going to be visible here on the camera, but you'll see them again when I go over top. All right, in addition to that, I also want to show you how to use salt, just regular plain table salt. So you'll want to have that handy. And then just some regular old plastic wrap as well. Now, the reason why I say you want to have them handy is these two techniques you must do while the watercolor is wet, all right? Now, in addition to showing you these last couple of techniques here, I also want to show you how to color mix on a piece of wax paper or freezer paper if you have that, or this is just simply what I call palette paper. You want something that just kind of has a glossy, sort of smooth finish to it. Even the lid of a plastic container would work as well, all right? But just something that you can lay out to work and mix colors on. I do not suggest mixing colors in the top of your watercolor pan, okay? Why? Because it usually ends up getting all dirty and gross, and I think it's better to kind of keep those clean, all right? So you want to think about maybe not mixing in your lids. All right, so I'm gonna take and I'm gonna bring some color over to my wax paper. So I wanna mix up, I think I'm gonna mix up sort of a red-violet kind of color. So I'm gonna get some red and bring it over to my palette paper, over to my wax paper. So I'm just making a little blob. And because the wax paper, again, has that real smooth, shiny surface, that color kind of collects back onto itself. And then I'm going to go in, I'm going to grab some violet, and I'm going to mix those two together. Okay, so I went a little heavy on the violet here. It's not quite as red as I would like it, so I'm going to pull in just a little bit more red. Okay, and now I have this sort of raspberry-esque color. I'm kind of liking it, so I'm going to go ahead and use that. All right, so the first thing I want to do is I'm going to show you this mixed color over top of those scratches. So if I take this raspberry color that I created and I go over those areas that I scratched onto the surface of my paper, you're going to notice that those scratches will reappear. They're going to appear as these dark, sort of textural lines that will look very different from having a dark line similar to that of the Sharpie marker. Okay, so you'll see that there's a difference in that texture. All right, I'm going to add back into this color because I'm going to need a little bit more to show you the other two techniques, the salt and the plastic wrap. So I'm going to pull in a bit more of my violet and kind of punch up this color here. This time, instead of red, I'm going to pull some blue in. So now I have this blue-violet kind of color, and why not? Let's pull a little bit of the red into there and see what happens. Kind of got very muted, so I'm just going to move all of that together. Wasn't too crazy about that color in particular. I'm going to pull that blue back into it, and we're going to go with that. All right, so I have this nice sort of liquidy watercolor mixture over here that I'm going to use, and I'm going to show you how to do the salt technique, so I want to have that handy. Okay, so what I'm going to do in order for this technique to work, I must have a wet area, okay, wet watercolor. So I'm going to drop some wet watercolor onto my paper, and then immediately, while that is still wet, I'm going to sprinkle some salt into it. And then I'm going to let that dry. Okay, what the salt will do is it will kind of make these tiny little bloomed textures in that area. Okay, in fact, if I pull this up, I wanted to show you, this was one that I did at another time. And if I run my finger over this, there is not any salt left on here. Okay, it dried and I brushed it off. So what was left behind was this little sort of texture left over. So once that's dry, I will brush those crystals off and do the same thing. Now the other technique, the last technique that I want to show you here was plastic wrap. Kind of works the same as the salt. I need to make sure that I have wet watercolor. All right, so I'm going to drop in, all right, I'm just going to do it even though it didn't come out great the last time, but I am going to pull in some red this time. We're going to go with that sort of more muted color. Again, I need to make sure that it's wet. And then I'm going to drop an area onto my paper. And while this color is wet on my paper, then what I need to do is take a small piece of plastic wrap and I'm going to let it go onto that wet surface. So what's going to happen is it's going to form a suction. And the areas that the suction is formed in creates these sometimes geometric forms, sometimes a little bit more organic. But basically what happens is that, plastic wrap will sit on there and dry. And then once the color underneath is dry, normally the plastic wrap will fall off. And what will be left behind is something that looks kind of like this area here, where you're going to have these sort of darker edges or these kind of interesting, almost like fractured planes or panels of color. All right, and that is the result of these suctioned areas that you can see with the plastic still on it. All right, so those are the techniques that we're going to be incorporating in to this piece. Now you'll notice over on the side here, I worked one of my designs, so I actually took a tracing of part of my final piece and I used the transferring process. You guys have done this before, where you use a piece of your tracing paper and I simply took my tracing out, transferred it onto my practice so that I can actually go on now and start to take some of these techniques and apply them to my actual drawing before I start working into that finalized piece. So this is another great way to practice, kind of pulling some of these different techniques together and then even starting to incorporate in the usage of the watercolor to see how the two interact along with your actual drawn design. All right, now while that color is wet, I'm actually going to lay my paper towel down. I'm going to push gently. I actually want to pick a little bit of that color up. And while it's still a bit on the wet side, I'm also going to drop in a little bit of extra color. So I'm just playing around here, getting some color blends, some color bleeds, and just really working with controlling the material. All right, seeing some of the interactions in between some of the colored pencil that I've added, some of the Sharpie marker that I've added. And again, this is just simply a play around in order to experiment before you start pulling all of these things together into your finalized piece, right? So what you should be doing in your sketchbook is working with these different techniques as I'm showing them here on the paper, trying them out in your sketchbook, seeing how they work, and then eventually we will tie together some of these watercolor techniques if you're interested in using them, along with your colored pencils, and also the color schemes that you selected as we begin to work into that finalized grid composition. And this is where we will pull everything together.